Hello and welcome to the 2021 Ohioana Book Festival. My name is Connie Berry. I'm the author of the Kate Hamilton Mysteries, and I am delighted to welcome you to the Historical Mysteries panel. We would like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana website. And thank you to our official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. You can purchase copies of all the books featured at the festival by going online to bookloft.com. And now I am pleased to welcome our fantastic authors, Nancy Herriman, if you would just give us a wave, Anna Lee Huber, and Jess Montgomery. So I'm going to do a few introductions first before we get to our authors. Nancy Herriman will go in alphabetical order. Retired from an engineering career to take up the pen, and she has not looked back. Her work has won the Daphne du Maurier Award, and Publishers Weekly says her A Mystery of Old San Francisco series brings 1867 San Francisco to vivid life. She is also the author of the Bess Elliott Mystery Series set in Tudor England. When not writing, she enjoys singing, gabbing about writing, eating dark chocolate, and she lives in Central Ohio. So Nancy, I wonder if you would tell us a little bit, if there's anything more you want to tell us about yourself. If not, tell us about No Quiet Among the Shadows, which is book 3 in the Old San Francisco series.
Hi, thanks. First, I'm so glad to be here with some wonderful fellow authors. My book, here it is, book 3, No Quiet Among the Shadows. I'm just going to read what's on the back here so that you know what it's about. With the city's, again, it's set in San Francisco, with the city's 4th of July celebrations in full swing, Celia Davies, my heroine, has stolen a moment away from her nursing duties to take in the festive spectacle, but is stunned when she spots the one person she thought she'd never see again, her supposedly dead husband. Moments later, the investigator who'd confirmed his death is killed, and Celia begins to fear that the roguish man she married has returned to haunt her life once again. Joining forces with Detective Nick Greaves to get to the bottom of the mystery, Celia is soon drawn into a murky seance group where the voices of the dead suggest that everyone involved in the case is engaged in some sort of fraud or deception. Determined to discover which of them might be a murderer, Celia and Nick will find themselves following a trail of clues that leads them down dark alleys into a shadowy tangle of spiritualism, altered identities, traumatic pasts, and secrets worth killing for. So that's the third in my Mystery of Old San Francisco series set in 1867, San Francisco, a couple of years after the Civil War ended.
Thank you. Is there anything more you want to tell us about yourself?
Not really, I don't think.
Okay. Well, in that case, we'll go on to Anna Lee Huber. Anna is the Daphne Award-winning author of the national best-selling Lady Darby mystery series set in 1830 Scotland. Also, the Verity Kent mysteries set in post-World War I England, and the Gothic Myth series set in Regency England, as well as the anthology, The Deadly Hour. She is a summa cum laude graduate of Lipscomb University in Nashville, where she majored in music and minored in psychology. She currently lives in Indiana and is hard at work on her next novel. When she is not writing, she enjoys reading, singing, travel, spending time with her family, and corralling a troublemaking tabby cat called PETA. Anna, again, anything else you want to tell us about yourself? And if not, tell us about A Wicked Conceit.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. This is always so much fun, even virtually. I would say the big thing I want to tell is just yesterday, I found out that A Wicked Conceit hit the USA Today bestseller list. So this is my first time, so it was super exciting. And A Wicked Conceit is the 9th book in my Lady Darby series. It's set in 1832 Edinburgh. And it sees Kira, my heroine, and her husband, Sebastian Gage, return to Edinburgh. She's very heavily pregnant. And they're planning to take it easy, but of course, trouble always finds them. And they are somewhat reluctant friends and allies with Bonnie Brock Kincaid, who is the head of Edinburgh's biggest criminal gang. And a book has been released about Bonnie Brock that he does not approve of. He had nothing to do with. He's very angry about. Plays have been made about it. It's this huge sensation, and Kira and Gage's name have been dragged into it also. And when the publisher is found murdered, they're all instantly suspects, and they have to figure out what's going on. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you. And last but not least, I want to introduce again Jess Montgomery. She is the author of the Kinship Historical Mystery Series, inspired by a true life 1920s female sheriff in Appalachia. Under her given name, she is a columnist for Writer's Digest, Level Up Your Writing Life, and also for the Dayton Daily News, where she focuses on the literary life, authors, and events of her native Dayton, Ohio. Her first novel, The Widows, won the 2019 Ohioana Awards Reader's Choice in Fiction. Jess is the 3-time recipient of the Individual Excellence Award in Literary Arts from the Ohio Arts Council, and has been a John E. Nance writer in residence at Thurber House in Columbus. And she lives in her native Ohio. And in addition to writing, she loves spending time with her family, reading, crocheting, baking, spoiling her cats. I'm seeing themes here, hiking, and occasionally fishing. So Jess, is there anything else you would like to tell us about yourself? And if not, tell us about the stills.
Oh, I'd be delighted to tell you about the stills, the third in my Kinship Mystery Series. And as you mentioned, it's set in 1920s Appalachian, Ohio, and inspired by Ohio's true first female sheriff. Of course, since it's set in the 1920s, Prohibition has played a role in the background of all the books up to this point. But 1927 is a really interesting year in Prohibition. And so I decided to bring it to the forefront of the plot. And in this outing, Sheriff Lily Ross has up to now been able to kind of, ignore a bit the occasional still in the hills and hollers, because those have always been there. And also, the county's been dry since way before Prohibition kicked in 1920. But in the stills, a big time bootlegger and gangster decides he's going to become part of, he's going to return to the community, go to the community and set up basically a distribution and warehouse center. And so he's bringing big time crime to her rural county, so she can't ignore it. And so that sets up the conflict for the whole book. The title also refers to those moments of stillness that we all need to take at times to kind of reflect and think about where we are in life. And since she became sheriff after her husband was killed in the line of duty, she's still processing that and taking these moments.
Oh, thank you, Jess. And thank you, all of you, for telling us about those books. My to-be-read list is getting higher and higher all the time. Let's get to our questions. It's interesting that each of you has chosen a different time period, a different place. So my first question is, what inspired you or drew you to the historical time periods you write about? And we're going to start with Anna.
Sure, yeah. So I write about, for the Lady Derby series, which is I'll mainly focus on, and I write the 1830s UK, a lot of times, mostly in Scotland, but there's a lot in England and even Ireland also. And I picked that time period because, well, for one, it wasn't used a lot. There's a lot of historical fiction written in the Regency, the larger Regency, and there's a lot of historical fiction written in the Victorian era, but the reign of William IV, which is sandwiched between, kind of gets ignored. And yet there's so much that goes on, and there's so much political turmoil and just changes in the Industrial Revolution and all these things. There's a lot of really important legislation that gets passed, Reform Acts and the Catholic Emancipation Act and the Anatomy Act and all these things. So there's so much great stuff to work with just for fiction, and to just delve in with research, which is always fascinating. And I also chose it because my heroine, her background, her first husband was an anatomist. And this was the time period when the anatomy schools, the only way they could get bodies for their dissections was from executed murderers. Well, there wasn't very many. And so they didn't have enough bodies to teach their, future doctors. And so this is the era of the body snatchers. And they were a necessary evil. And at this point in time, though, we've had Burke and Hare in Edinburgh who were snatching people and murdering them and selling them to anatomists. And then it comes about in 1831 that it's happening in London. And so there's a lot of panic and there's a lot of drive to finally pass this Anatomy Act to change things. But because of Kira's background and her late anatomist husband, who was involved with body snatchers, who forced her to sketch his dissections and all of that, she's this figure of scandal. And so it was just the time period I had to set her in to deal with all this and wrangle with it. And it's fascinating stuff.
That is fascinating. Thank you. And Jess, I'm going to go to you next. What drew you to the setting and the historical period that you write about?
Well, I've always been intrigued by the 1920s in general. I think a lot of people are. But honestly, I had never thought about writing historical fiction set in the 1920s until I came across the true first female sheriff in 1925 in Ohio, a woman named Maud Collins. And I was just fascinated by the notion of a female sheriff in the 1920s anywhere. What's more, in a very rural part of our state. And side note, the next female sheriff was 1976 in the state of Ohio. Obviously there have been police officers and deputy sheriffs, but the next county sheriff in the state of Ohio was in 76. And the next two after that were in the year 2000 and 2020. So it's still incredibly rare. And so I was fascinated by that. And I would never honestly have thought, I know, I'll write a series set in a very rural area in mid-1920s featuring a female sheriff, unless there, had been one, and there was. And so my writer's imagination kicked in, and I thought, what if, unlike in real life, there was a mystery around why the male sheriff was killed, and his widow decided to investigate. And it just kind of went from there. And as I started reading about the 1920s, I realized there wasn't a lot in fiction or nonfiction about rural areas in the 1920s. But at the same time, I also realized that the big sweeping issues of the 1920s would definitely touch those individual lives in a rural area. So I wanted to explore that, and the setting played a big part too. My family's from Appalachia, so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more.
Okay, we had a little discussion earlier on off camera about how you pronounce that, and I've heard it Appalachia and I've heard it Appalachia. So which is correct?
They're probably both correct. I just pronounce it the way my mom and dad and my mama and papa and my aunts and uncles and cousins all pronounced it. So
okay, well that's good enough for me. Okay, let's go to Nancy now. Same question. What drew you to the historical setting and time period?
So my female sleuths always seem to be involved in the nursing area. And I wanted to make use of the fact that, that in the mid-1800s, nursing was becoming a more organized and more serious pursuit for women. So my heroine is English and received her training during the Crimean War, which also happened to be the time period that Florence Nightingale became well-known, famous, and did a lot of her work. So that sort of set the beginning of her time period. But then I wanted to pursue the theme of anti-immigration issues in America, which I found very relevant to the time that I started writing the book, as continues to be. And in 1867, California, the anti-Chinese movement began in earnest. And I wanted to pursue that. So that became the set point for my time period. So the books open with the murder of a Chinese girl that my sleuth, Celia, the woman had been a patient of hers. And so she becomes involved in trying to understand who might have killed this girl, because she expects that the police will have no particular interest in trying to find the woman's killer. I also find the period, much as Anna does for the early 1800s, the mid to late 1860s was continuing this fast change in technology and social structures, movement of people, rapid growth of cities, people moving from rural areas into cities. And it just seems like this mix and interplay just caused a lot of strife and a lot of background noise, if you will, that sometimes makes it a really interesting land of opportunity for a crime to occur. Lots of people struggling, lots of people succeeding, lots of people failing. It's an interesting and fascinating time period, and I rather love it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm sure you've all been asked this question before, but I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. One thing every historical writer is asked is, how do you do your research to make sure you get things right for the time period? And I'll just open it up, whoever would like to go first.
In terms of like resources, some of my favorite are like the actual memoirs and journals and letters written by the people of that time. Just because you really get to hear what they're talking about and interested in, you hear their language, the kind of phrasings they're using. And also a great tip is at the back of research books, I always look at the bibliography, because I find some of my best resources just looking at the bibliography from other books that I never would have stumbled across otherwise. I found a memoir from my Verity Kent series by the captain who ran the resistance networks within Belgium for the British during the war. And he spills all this great information that I never would have found without it. So.
Yeah, I agree with Anna. I've used a lot of memoirs through Google Books, my favorite thing in the whole world. Whoever decided to do that, I love them. But yeah, I've used a lot of memoirs that were written. People really liked to write memoirs, especially in the 1860s. It became quite a big business for everybody who'd ever been anywhere to write a memoir. So there is rich information about San Francisco in the 1860s. It was a huge travel destination even then. The best resource I ever used was an English woman who spent 3 years in the Bay Area, and she wrote about everything she'd done, everywhere she'd gone, her little vacation tips. And it's just, but you know, all the little things that people might do while they went on vacation, if you were rich enough, I suppose, you know, to spend 3 years in the Bay Area. I also really like California. One thing that's wonderful about writing in California is they love their history, and they have digitized almost every newspaper that they've ever had published, or for at least many decades worth. So I will read newspaper articles of the time, the specific day. I can check the weather. I can check some odd accident that happened. I mean, quite often it informs the crimes that I want to talk about, because this happened, that happened, is like, ooh, wouldn't that make a nice, interesting setting or an interesting event that occurred? So Google Books, newspapers.
Yeah, I like to look at, I haven't read memoirs, I admit, and for research. I've read memoirs, but not for research. But I do like newspaper articles. I like looking at old ads just to see, you know, especially from the area I'm writing about, like, would canned soup be available in the general store in 1927, for example? And I love to go to museums that are about the topic I'm writing about, or in the area I'm writing about. So I've been to a couple of coal mining museums in the area that I write about. A big shout out to the Anti-Saloon League Museum up in Westerville, Ohio, which I visited as I researched the stills. I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing I'm the only visitor who leapt and shouted with glee, literally, at a display that included a Vino Sano dried grape brick, which was used to make wine. So it was supposed to be reconstituted sort of like Kool-Aid powder, but it was literally a brick into grape juice. But if you forgot to follow the instructions about putting in baking soda to keep it from fermenting, there's a warning on the brick, and you accidentally left it in a dark place for 3 weeks or so, it might ferment into perfectly legal wine.
Wow,
so museums.
Jess, you're a little bit different in that you have some personal history in that area, and you also are writing about not writing about a real person, but you have a real person to base it on. Has that helped your research?
So like I mentioned earlier, my family of origin is from Appalachia in Eastern Kentucky. So that definitely has helped with understanding the culture, the dialect, the foods, the crafts, the music. So I pull from all of that. And my younger daughter went to Ohio University, which is in southeastern Ohio. So I visited there quite a bit. So yeah, I think it's helped in that regard. In terms of being inspired by the true first female sheriff in Ohio, it's definitely inspired by her. I'm not writing her story. In real life, her husband died when he was serving notice to somebody for a traffic violation, and the person he was serving the notice to killed him. There were tons of witnesses. There was absolutely no mystery, and Mrs. Collins went on to serve a couple terms as sheriff and have a full life in criminal justice. So, I'm not trying to document her life, but the fact she lived this interesting life gives me permission to write about my take, Lily Ross.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Nancy, do you tend to do a lot of research in advance of beginning or plotting your book? Or do you do research as it comes up as you're writing, or both?
Both. I think when I began the series, I probably did a lot more. No, I know I did a lot more research up front. Yeah. One of the benefits of continuing a series is having all that background knowledge already available to you, so I don't have to keep reinventing the wheel or re-researching stuff I'd already looked at. So I'll have, some general ideas of what kind of a setting I want the book to be placed in, or the particular story to be placed in, and I might do some upfront research then. But usually it's not a very efficient way to write, but I'll be in the middle of a sentence going, dang it, what was that? What was that kind of stove called? Or this is where I can second Jess's love of advertising. Boy, there's nothing more fun than finding a bunch of advertisements for products at the period of time. It's its own rabbit hole. So I think it's a mix.
Anna, how about you?
Yeah, same thing. And just like Nancy, it's like when you first start a series in a time period, you really have to immerse yourself. There's so much you don't even think about that you have to know. What did they eat? What did they wear? What did they, all those things, and so then it's definitely spot research depending on, when I start a book, I do a hunk of research because I know whatever the book plot is going to be about that I need to know for the story. And it varies depending on the book. Some books follow echo history a lot closer than others. And then, as I'm going along, I'm like Nancy too. It's like something will pop up and it'll be like, I really need to know what this is. Sometimes I can like stick it in parentheses and look it up later, but other times it's like, you can't really move forward until you find that answer. So
that's great. Well, speaking of research, what is the strangest or most bizarre thing you've ever stumbled across in your research? And we'll just open this up for anybody.
For mine, the stills, one of the subplots is one of the younger characters, a young girl named Frankie, has asthma, and her mother, Marvina, is desperate to, find a way to help her be more comfortable and healthy. And so they've tried everything from different teas to steam baths to, what have you. And I was surprised through an advertisement to learn that there were asthma cigarettes. And so she procures asthma cigarettes. There were all kinds of brands. And the notion was it wasn't just tobacco. There were other like medicines or herbs rolled in with the tobacco. And I think the brand I use is Page Inhalers. And the idea is you have to inhale it and hold it in your lungs. And, and poor Frankie, her mother, has her use these inhalers. And it just seems to make her worse for some reason,
Whatever. Yeah. I don't understand. Mine is also medical, but that's also because what I always end up writing about. Anyway, I have this bizarre fascination for medicine. I don't know why I went into engineering, but when I was researching one of my more recent books in the San Francisco series, I came upon, and it's unbelievable, this craze for medical batteries. It was a big thing in the 1860s, 1870s. I think it really hit its peak in about 1880. And they wanted to shock you with voltage to cure just about anything: rheumatism, impotence, loss of hearing, you name it. They were gonna. And I wanted to use it as a method of killing somebody because it seemed just too perfect. But I didn't. But when I was writing my tutor books, I got the one medical cure that got the most comments was the medieval use of sheep dung to cure wounds. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but people thought it worked.
Let's see. So for my most recent book, I would say the most bizarre kind of interesting thing I found was that, so at this time period that I'm writing about, the new type of genre that's popular is called Newgate novels, where the authors are basically romanticizing the lives of criminals. And there was a really popular book called Jack Shepherd. It was actually huge. It morphed into this huge, there were plays everywhere because they didn't have to pay the authors to use the books. And it was just this crazy sensation, like nowadays. And one of the things that came out of it was that the authors would write like thieves' cant songs. Okay. So it's all slang. And the plays picked up these thieves' cant songs and turned them into music. And they were in the plays and everybody was singing them. And it was like popular music. And the aristocracy and all these upper class people are singing these thieves' cant songs. They have no idea what they're about. Their children are playing them on the violin, like sheet music. There was a cathedral in Edinburgh that played it with the bells. I mean, it was everywhere. And it was this horrible song about what it was about, I just thought that was so just bizarre and too like real life. I mean, how many times have we heard a song, a totally inappropriate, the lyrics, but we hear the tune somewhere and we're like, what?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
We live today in a completely different era in terms of technology a lot. And I remember years ago when everybody were getting microwaves, and I thought, do you really have to have your food hot that quick? Well, yes, we do. And we have to have everything quick. We have to have answers quickly. Going on Google, we have to be able to call someone quickly. We can order something online from Amazon and we get it almost the next day. So what I'm wondering is, what effect does the lack of modern technology like cell phones and computers have on your plotting? Because we all know that we need to keep the pace going. So how do you keep the pace moving when your protagonist can't have instant answers and may have to wait a long time?
I think that not having it forces you to be more clever, because you have to figure out a way why would they find out this information? How would they find it out? How would they know this? And so it forces me to be more creative. And so it kind of forces me to go down different avenues. I love it because that I might not have thought of if I just had the easy out. And sorry, what was the second part of the question? Oh God, and I've like totally forgot. What was the second part that you asked?
No, just how do you keep things moving when your protagonist can't have answers instantly?
Right. I mean, I guess it forces you to be creative. It really is the answer for me, and to focus on other aspects than just the instant knowledge. It can be the atmosphere, because I mean, man, the time period I read about, it can be really gothic-y and mysterious. I mean, you don't have electricity, you don't have, so you can really play into that setting and into that atmosphere, and the characters, not knowing what's going on with the other people because you can't Google who they are. And, so there's a lot more drama in that sense.
Yeah. And people could hide their identities so much easier in the past.
You just move somewhere else and change your name, and who knows who you are.
Yeah.
I feel like my books would probably be about the length of a novella if I could have everybody have a quick answer. Unfortunately, that really serves my plots, I feel, just because it forces my sleuths. I always write duos. So actually there's two of them trading points of view. That they have to go out and find the answers. They have to go out and do research. They just can't call and find out, for instance, if somebody lived somewhere or might have been involved in some business somewhere. They have to go there. So it gets them into trouble. My Celia is always finding herself on the wrong side of a problem when she tries to go poke around. So for my series, I think it really benefits. It provides all kinds of information. Although I am really grateful that at this time period, the city of San Francisco published city directories, much like we would think of a telephone directory, where everybody lived and where businesses were located. So they do, if they're looking for someone, they at least do have kind of a printed resource. They don't have to ask around and find out. But I don't think it hurts at all. So
yeah, I really like leaning into the fact that, there's not going to be DNA testing to rely on or something like that, which didn't exist in the 1920s. And, at least in the area where my detective lives, there wasn't fingerprinting handily available either. So I really like the notion of and my books are, it's the kinship series. So it's not just a place name. It's about the notion of kinship, whether it's a community or a family or a friend group. And so my detective, Sheriff Lily Ross, kind of has to rely on that the connection she has in the community to gain people's trust, to give her just a thread of information so she can go ask a question somewhere else. So I really kind of enjoy that.
Sounds like all three of you do, which is fascinating. We're kind of delving into plotting here. And so what I wonder is, how do you start? Now you all would start with a time period and a general setting, I would think, but do you start with plot, or do you start with character, or do you start with something else?
I have started with theme, which is related to plot, but I usually, in each of my books, I have an idea I want to pursue. And quite often it's a parallel with something that's occurring now. So for instance, in my first San Francisco book, I wanted to pursue anti-immigrant hatred as a reason for a murder, and just the general idea. I've looked at greed. I've looked at rapid overdevelopment, which was a huge problem in San Francisco in the 1860s. And so that kind of feeds the plot. I have an idea that I want to bring up, and I build a story around that.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would say that my overall theme for my series is about the tension between individuals and community. That we need both individuality, but we also need community, and one can help the other, but one can also kind of hurt the other. So I like to look at a different aspect of that for each book in the series. And then my next step is to, think about, I also write a dual narrator. It's Lily Ross and then a person from the community. So the second narrator, if you will, changes each book. But I start then thinking about their character arcs, like what do they need to learn about themselves through the course of whatever the story is going to be, that they don't even realize they need to learn about themselves until the story has wrapped up. And so then from there, I kind of pull the plot elements.
I would say for me, it kind of varies depending on the book. Sometimes it's a certain murder plot that I need to happen that I've read about, or I just love the idea of, or it's a moment in history. One of my books is all about the London Burkers and what happened, and paralleling that whole arrest and trial and everything. But most of the time it comes down to my characters. I always say I write mysteries, but they're really the framework of the plot. My books are really about the characters, and my main characters and the secondary characters. And so they drive a lot of the story. I usually know where I want to go with all my characters and things that they need to deal with and wrestle with in the future, faster than I know what I want murder mystery to go around it. So a lot of times I know where I need my characters to be and what they need to deal with. And then I'm figuring out a way to have a mystery work in with that and to accentuate it. So.
Okay, interesting. Well, you've all written about series and themes and characters. And so the question is, when you're writing a series, and a series in which people get murdered, it brings in that Cabot Cove dilemma where you eventually run out of people. So what I'm wondering is, do you tend to bring in new characters with every book, or do you tend to work with a larger cast of characters that you've already fleshed out to some degree?
For me, my characters actually move around. So they're always encountering new people. Either they're going there for another reason, or they're called there because the husband Gage is a gentleman inquiry agent. So a lot of their aristocratic friends, this is pre-police in a lot of areas. It's just the very beginning of the Metropolitan Police in London per se. And they didn't do detecting for the first 10 years. I mean, they just did preventing crime, excuse me. So anyway, so they get called a lot of places to help out when something happens, or they just happen to be there, or it happens because they're there. But because they move them around, it allows me to have a broader cast. I would say I have my cast that I recurringly use, and whether they're main characters or their family or that, but then I'm always adding in new characters. So there's a broader range of people to deal with.
Same here. I have a core group of individuals in my stories. And it feels almost Dickensian sometimes in the amount of characters that I have to keep track of. The core keeps getting larger and larger, I feel. But yeah, for every particular novel, each book, they have an additional set of characters who are relevant to the particular crime that's occurred. So, they get killed off, not any of my main folks so far. So.
Yeah, it's very similar. I have a core cast that's probably way too big, but I love them all. So, there are a lot of people tucked in those hills and hollers that can pop out and perhaps get murdered. So, and people, it's much harder to travel in that area, even, just from town to town, back in the 1920s. But people, sometimes a stranger does come to town. So.
Uh-oh. So have you ever killed off one of your main cast of characters? Have you ever really felt sad to let somebody go?
So for my second book, Mortal Arts, I do kill off kind of he wouldn't have been a main staple character anyway, but he was very important to my heroine, Lady Darby Kira. And so that was really hard. That was the hardest killing I've had to write, I guess you would say, just because he was such a great character, but for the story, it had to be that way. And yeah, so that, I think that's the only time I've done it so far. So, but yeah, that's the one.
Anybody else?
Sad with my first novel, The Widows, which you wouldn't think if you read it, because it's not a spoiler at all. The Sheriff Daniel Ross is killed like within the first chapter. You know, he's very quickly killed, and that sets the whole thing in motion for Lily to become sheriff. But I will confess, amongst writers here and any writers who are listening, that when I was playing with this this novel and the series, I thought I had this great, looking back, kind of idiotic idea that I would, even though I knew he would die right away, I would write about him from his point of view. Like he would be shot and dying and then flash back for his whole life. So, which is cringeworthy when I think about it, but I fortunately cut all 90 pages. But in writing those 90 pages, I really got to know him. So it was actually really good that I had this idea that would not make sense in a final book, as sort of an exercise for me, because I, you know, he became really real to me. So by the time he's killed in like a sentence, I'm really sad about it. But what was great was that Lily, his widow, and a childhood friend, Marvina, they know him really well because I know him really well now. And through the 90 pages that I wrote, I was able to pull from that and let those bits arise naturally in their thoughts, their memories, their conversations. So other than that, I've been fine with murdering the people I've murdered fictionally. I've never, you know, yeah, so.
Fine. Oh, Jess. I've come close, but I haven't killed off any of the characters. The core characters, I guess. I remember talking with James Ben, who writes a wonderful World War II series, about having killed off a love interest of his main character and the male that he got as a result, which was none too kind. So take that as it's a dangerous territory to get rid of characters that readers love. Sure. Just like killing off dogs or something. Don't ever kill any animals. Right?
Yeah. Don't do that.
Don't do that ever.
We have a question from the audience, and I think it's an interesting one. It's from Jen Albritton. And the question is, if you write about real people from history, so I'm going to make that a separate question. Have you ever included real people of that time period that you write about? But if you do that, have you ever run into problems with surviving family members who don't want their relatives portrayed as involved with any kind of criminality?
Yeah, this is actually something I worry about, because I don't want to misrepresent people or I don't want to cause this kind of trouble. I've had some tangential characters, and San Francisco at this time was full of a lot of interesting people. I did have Levi Strauss make an appearance in my second book. Now that was kind of hard because there's not a whole lot written about Levi Strauss. So he was just in for a scene. I didn't want to he didn't become a major character, but, and there were a couple of very interesting, kind of quirky, San Francisco seemed to collect people that thought they were great leaders, like generals that weren't generals, or leaders of countries that they weren't leaders of countries. So they were always walking around in their regalia, and people used to, I mean, if there would have been selfies back in 1860, these would have been the perfect Instagram photos.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to be associated with these characters, but so they will make guest appearances, but I personally have never really used a real person in a book. I feel, I don't know, too leery of making, I want to respect them or treat them with respect that they may or may not deserve, I guess, I don't know. And I just don't tend to do that. So no, I guess.
So as I've said, my main character is inspired by a true person, but there are a lot of books like that. You know, there are the books that were about Zelda Fitzgerald, for example, and the law says that, you know, you can do that. And, you know, I'm not, and I make it very clear, I am not documenting the life of the person that inspired my character. And I portray Lily as, you know, she's on the right side of the law. So I can't anticipate that there would be any pushback. And if there were, there really honestly wouldn't be a legal leg to stand on. I do in the stills bring in, and he's part of the series thus far, a character named George Vogel, who's inspired by the true life gangster George Remus out of Chicago and then Cincinnati. So I pull from Remus's life, and I do not portray him sympathetically at all, but he is super well documented as not being a nice guy. And he's been portrayed on Boardwalk Empire, for example, is, actually my portrayal makes him look a lot more intelligent than Boardwalk Empire did. So there's that. And then kind of like you, Nancy, with your Levi Strauss, I have the true Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt from the 1920s, makes a little cameo appearance. And I don't change her name at all. I just, it's plausible that she could have shown up and talked with Lily. There are definite historic reasons why she would have and could have done that. So I just thought, why not? Let's have her there for a page and a half. I make up dialogue for her. I describe her as she looked in real life. And I just thought it was too cool. This lady's really pretty cool to have an assistant attorney general, the highest ranking woman in government in that year, and as well known as, celebrity actors and actresses are now at the time. So there you go.
Yeah, I'm a lot like them. I have tertiary characters that are people we know. I mean, like Lord Melbourne was in one of my books, but they're always kind of just very background, or they're mentioned, or I haven't really delved into a real life character for that very reason, just because I'm not really exploring their specific history. If I was writing a historical fiction book specifically about them, that would be different. But because I'm writing a fictional series, I just figured, they're there, but they're not, I'm not going to go too deep into who they are, except what's really well documented. And I even am that way about places, because I have them move around so much. I will purposely alter the name of a castle, even by a letter or two, just because if I have a murder happen there or something maybe not so complimentary, I just don't want to cast that light. So it's easy to change a letter or two and still be like, this is based on this castle, but it's not this castle, so.
I did that with the county where Sheriff Ross serves. I made up an 89th county for Ohio. So I have gotten letters that say, Bronwyn County isn't really a county. I'm like, I know that. But I didn't want readers to think I was documenting the history of Vinton County or Athens County, because I'm not. So.
Nancy, you're writing about a real city, San Francisco, in a time period. So how much time does it take you to get things right, like where things are located and what buildings would have been there at that particular time?
I'm gonna lean over and show you something, because I'm sitting at my writing desk. These are maps of San Francisco in the 1860s. I can tell you where they didn't call them cable cars yet because they weren't cable cars, but I can tell you where every railroad goes in the town if she needs to take one. What's really interesting is that there are errors there are discrepancies, I should say, in the record. So like sometimes you'll find a building that's not on the actual, it'll be shown on different streets or something. So it doesn't help my confusion. I try very, very hard, but the only reason I can get away with it in San Francisco is because it is fairly well documented. And there is a lot of information, but sometimes I'll like my book that just came out is set at a water cure facility, which they did exist in the city. There were about 4 or 5 of them at the time, but I didn't use any of the particular ones that actually existed. So I made up a different place and moved it up a street or something like that. So sometimes I will choose, kind of like Anna said with their castles. I will base a setting on a real place, but change it just enough so that it's not the actual place. But if I reference a church, which I've done, it's the real church and it's where it was, and where the police station is where the police station was, or theaters or things like that. So yeah.
So anybody else? Anna, Jess?
Oh yeah, same thing. Like London and Edinburgh, you just find the old maps and go off those and the resources you can find. And yeah, I mean, when I describe the cities, the places are where they are. I really just changed the names of like castles and things. Or, you know, if I murder someone in a city, they didn't probably really exist, so their townhouse was actually somebody else's townhouse, you know, kind of thing. You know, I mean, like the book I said in London, it follows the London Burkers really closely. And interestingly enough, the city has changed so much from that time period. So it's really hard to even find some of the places where things happened. But yeah, the maps are invaluable. Yeah, great resources.
Mm-hmm. And the thing too about San Francisco is because of the earthquake and all that happened, a lot of the city has moved. Most of that burned down. What didn't fall down burned down. And so people might be like, oh, I didn't know that was there. I was like, well, you know, the city is almost completely had to regrow after that horrific event in the early 1900s.
And Jess, you've made up your own county, but do you look at old maps? Do you have any resources that kind of help you to build this county that you've created?
Sure. So I stay very true to the topography and the natural history of the area. And I look at old maps. There weren't a ton of main paved roads, but I try to stay true to, you know, what would have been there on roads that are still there. So I'm able to kind of visit and cast my imagination back in time, as it were, erase the McDonald's, imagine a tree kind of thing. And yeah, I rely on that and just sort of visiting the area and knowing the topography. There's a lot of nature and descriptions and that kind of thing in my books, more than cities, so.
Well, you all are experienced writers. Some of you have multiple series going. You've been writing for some time. How has your writing changed since you first started? Or has it changed?
I like to think I've gotten more confident. I don't know that I have, but I like to think I have. I do think I've gotten, and this is sort of a pretentious word, but deeper in the sense of thinking a lot more deeply than I once did about why a character would do something, what really motivates their actions. So I think I've changed in that regard.
I would say same thing, gotten more confident, gotten faster, you know, just, you know, all those, I think you just grow as a writer. You, as with any skill, you just get better at it. You know, and so over time, things go faster, things feel more confident, you know, your characters better, you can tap into them more easily, all those kind of things. Yeah.
And I agree with getting faster. That's certainly true. And I've learned to trust that I am going to figure out how to do it. Yeah, so I don't allow my stumbles to last as long as they might have in the past. I've written enough that I know I'll figure this out, just put it down. If I delete the scene eventually, it doesn't matter. It's there. Sometimes they come back in another book. You know, you can have no writing is bad. No writing is a missed opportunity. It's always something you can make use of. So yeah, faster. I can't believe how much faster I can write than I ever used to. So
excellent. As you've been describing your books, it just seems to me that there's so much detail, there's so much thought, there's so much planning that goes into it. So in my mind, I'm thinking that you are all plotters. And for our audience, we always talk about you're either a plotter, which means you plot everything out in some detail in advance, or you're a pantser, which means you fly by the seat of your pants and you just kind of start writing and you see where the characters take you. Some people are a combo. Sometimes they call them plotzers, but I'm thinking, so you're going to have to tell me if I'm right, that you're plotters, but are you?
Well, not anymore.
Not anymore?
Not to the extent that I started. Since my past, I always tell this story, but when I started since I had been an engineer and I have an engineering degree, and I believed when I first started writing before I was published, that all I would have to do would be like lay it out, very details, and then a book would appear. So I probably plotted a whole lot more in the beginning, but I pretty quickly realized that it didn't matter what I plotted, the book would end up being different. So I usually plot about the first half. I try to get myself a rough idea of what the first half of the book is going to look like so that I can at least get started. And then I pretty much just write. Potser, I don't know.
Do you know in advance how it will end?
Yeah.
Okay, so
I don't always, almost every book I've written, the murderer is not who I thought it was going to be.
Okay, well, I want to hear from Anna and Jess on that too.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I honestly believe when you first start writing, you're discovering what your process really is. Like, you can't really know until you've written, I don't know how many books, because it just evolves, and you have to lean into what works for you, because you ask 100 authors this question, 100 are going to give you different answers. I mean, so for people that want to write, this is just what we do. What works for you may be totally different. But yeah, I plot loosely. I kind of have an outline. I know who some of my suspects are going to be, those kind of things. And then I just go with it. And I find if I plot too tightly, I'm actually stifled. My creativity is stifled. Whereas if I just let myself write and lean into it, I come up with so many better ideas. I've stopped figuring out who the murderer is, like Nancy said, because they just change. Somebody else will raise their hand and I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's way better. And so in edits, you go back and you fix stuff, and smooth things over. And so for me, it just works better that way, to just lean into it and do it that way. And I've figured out too that I'm more of a procrastinator than I ever would have thought. And so I just lean into it. I mean, it's because it's how it's going to be anyway. So why agonize when I know that's what's going to happen? So
exactly. Yeah. I've like both of you, I've been, I always start out thinking I know who the killer is, and then I'm surprised each time. And I'm always like, oh, it's you? Oh, okay. But I think that's good, because if I'm surprised, then hopefully readers will be too. I do like to build what I call sort of an infrastructure, so that I know the cast, I know, the main bones of the story. And how people interrelate is really important to me to figure out ahead of time. And then, I just kind of plot as I go. I finish a scene or a chapter, and I put it in a spreadsheet, honestly, so that I can keep track of, from this point of view, this is what happened. Oh, then from the other point of view, this is what happened. So I can kind of see. And then, there's a whole lot of looping back and rewriting. And really my process is it's a mess until it's not.
Until deadline hits. Then it resolves itself.
Or as somebody in my publishing team once said to me, and I loved this, she said, at some point we just have to call it done and print the books. So I'm like, good point,
Well, I think that in our audience, there may be some aspiring writers, and I'm sure they've been fascinated to hear about your process. But what would be your number one best advice for someone who aspires to be a fiction writer?
Well, first, write. the easiest way to learn is to write. You have to. You just write and write and write and write. That is how you learn. That's how you figure your style out and your tone and your voice and all that.
Yeah.
And then in terms of industry, I would figure out what genre you're writing in and try to join a group that is for that genre. For example, we all write mystery. Mystery Writers America. Sisters in Crime has a wonderful group called the Guppies for people who are aspiring authors. I always recommend aspiring mystery authors join because they just have so many resources you won't get elsewhere. So
good. That's great advice.
My advice is the one that I have to remind myself all the time is the first draft does not have to be perfect.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it's kind of related to the just right.
Yeah, another great piece of advice. And Jess, how about you?
I would say adding to all of that, which is, I agree with all of that, and it's good advice, is to read. You need to know, the genre in which you write. Read things that you love. Read things that you don't think you're going to like. Read outside of your genre. Be a really good reader as well as a good writer.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left. So if you could real briefly tell us what is next on the agenda for you, something you're working on, something that's going to be coming out. Nancy, how about you?
My fourth book in this series just came out last week, No Darkness As Like Death. So this is actually the fourth one. And I'm working on the fifth one in my San Francisco series right now.
Okay, thank you. And Anna, how about you?
So Murder Most Fair, I just got my ARCs in the mail. The fifth book in the Verity Kent mystery series, that comes out on August 31st. And in that series, my heroine's, she was a spy during World War I for the British. So there's a lot of carryover from the war and just general mysteries.
Cool. And Jess?
So the stills just came out about a month ago, and I'm working on revisions to The Echoes, which will be the fourth book in this series, and it will be out from Minotaur Books next, I think, January 2022.
Thank you. Well, once again, my name is Connie Berry, and I want to thank our panelists, Nancy Herriman, Annalee Huber, and Jess Montgomery. I've had such a good time talking to you today. And I also want to end with a reminder that you can get copies of all of these books by our wonderful authors at the Book Loft in German Village or online at www.bookloft.com. I want to again thank our festival sponsors and partners, and thank you, our audience, for joining us today. Please check out the Ohioana website for all the festival programming. Happy reading, and we'll say goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.